My name is Angela, and I never imagined that my life would come to an end that day. It was meant to be just another cold but calm winter morning. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint glow across the frozen streets, and everything outside was covered in a thick sheet of ice. The trees stood motionless under the weight of frost, and the world seemed still, untouched, as though time itself had slowed. I pulled my coat tighter around me as I stepped outside, my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. It was early and the neighborhood was still asleep, with the only noise being the faint crunch of ice under my boots. I was simply heading to my car, just like I did every other morning, my thoughts already focused on the day ahead. Errands to run, work to do, and calls to make. It was just another day, another morning, like so many before, and nothing seemed unusual. Then before I even realized what was happening, my foot slipped. It happened so quickly that I didn't have time to react. One moment I was walking toward my car, keys tightly gripped in my gloved hand, and the next the ground disappeared beneath me. There was no time to brace myself, no way to stop the inevitable. My body lurched backward, and before I could even process the fall, my head slammed against the icy pavement. A sharp pain shot through my skull, but it lasted only a moment before everything around me became a blur. The sky above twisted, and the pale morning light flickered like a candle about to burn out. My ears rang, and then, just as suddenly as it all started, everything went silent. The cold that had numbed my skin moments earlier was gone. The pain in my head vanished. The weight of my body, the sensation of the icy pavement pressing against my back, all of it disappeared in an instant. I was gone. I should have been terrified. I should have felt panic, confusion, anything. But instead, I felt the complete opposite. There was no fear, no distress, no pain. Only warmth, a sensation so overwhelming and pure that it filled every part of me. It wasn't just the physical warmth you feel when you step into a heated room after being outside in the cold. It was something deeper, something I had never experienced before. It surrounded me, embraced me, as if I were being held by something far greater than anything I had ever known. I opened my eyes, but I wasn't lying on the freezing ground anymore. The winter sky, the icy pavement, the neighborhood, all of it was gone. I was somewhere else, and at first I couldn't understand where that was. Everything around me was light, not harsh, artificial light, but a soft, living glow that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't blinding, but neither was it dim. It was as though the very air itself carried its own radiance, not just illuminating the space, but filling it with something more. There were no shadows, no corners left in darkness. The light was everywhere, and it was unlike anything I had ever seen. I took a step forward, but my feet didn't feel the ground beneath me in the usual way. I wasn't floating, yet I wasn't weighed down either. There was no heaviness, no strain on my body, no aching from the fall. Everything about me felt different, lighter, freer, as if I had been released from something I hadn't even realized was holding me back. Then I felt it, a presence. I didn't hear footsteps, no sound announcing someone's approach, but I knew without a doubt that I was not alone. It was as though the very air around me carried the awareness of someone else, someone powerful, someone beyond my understanding. The warmth that had enveloped me since I arrived grew even stronger, filling me with an overwhelming sense of peace. I turned, and there he was. I had never seen him like this before, but I knew exactly who he was. There was no mistaking him. He stood before me watching, his expression calm, yet filled with something deeper, something that held more love than I had ever known in my entire life. There was no fear in his presence, no feeling of unworthiness or shame, only complete, absolute understanding. Jesus. I had spent my entire life believing in him, praying to him, speaking his name, but standing before him, I realized that no words, no sermons, no songs could ever truly convey what it meant to be in his presence. It wasn't just his appearance, it was who he was. Every part of me felt known in that moment. Every thought I had ever had, every doubt, every moment of joy, every mistake. And still, I was not afraid. He saw it all, yet his love for me remained unchanged. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything. But before I could, he raised his hand ever so slightly, and in that moment, something passed between us. Not in words, not in sound, but in understanding. I didn't need to ask where I was. I already knew. I was no longer in the world I had known. I had died, but death wasn't what I had imagined. It wasn't an end. It wasn't darkness or nothingness. It was something more, a transition, a crossing from one existence to another. Yet there was something about this moment that felt significant, as though it wasn't the end of my journey, but the beginning of something else. Jesus looked at me, his eyes holding a sorrow I hadn't expected. There was love, there was peace, but there was also something else. Something that felt like longing, like sadness, not for himself, but for what he was about to show me. There is something you need to see, he said. The moment the words left his lips, everything around me shifted. The light that had surrounded us didn't disappear, but it dimmed slightly. Before I could fully grasp what was happening, the world around me changed. I wasn't in that peaceful place anymore. I was somewhere else, and what I saw next would change everything I thought I knew. The world around me was nothing like the one I had just left. I was no longer lying on the frozen ground, no longer feeling the sharp sting of cold against my skin, no longer burdened by the weight of my body. Instead, I stood in a place I could barely describe, a place that felt more real than anything I had ever known. The air itself seemed alive, carrying a warmth that wasn't just physical, but something deeper, something that touched every part of me. There was light everywhere, but it didn't come from one single source. It wasn't like the sun casting rays from above, or a lamp illuminating one spot. It was everywhere at once, filling the space, wrapping around me in a way that made me feel completely safe, completely at peace. It wasn't blinding, yet it was more brilliant than any light I had ever seen. I looked down at myself, expecting to see my coat, gloves, boots, everything I had been wearing before I fell, but none of it was there. I wasn't sure if I had a body in the way I had always known it. I could move, I could feel, I could think, but there was no pain, no cold, no sensation of weight or discomfort. I wasn't burdened by anything, not even gravity itself. It was as though I was still me, but without all the limitations that had come with being human. Before I could fully take in what was happening, I felt something, something beyond the light, beyond the warmth. It wasn't something I heard or saw, but something I instantly knew. There was a presence near me, one so strong, so pure, so overwhelmingly powerful that I should have felt afraid. Yet I wasn't. I turned inward and he was there. I didn't need anyone to tell me who he was. There was no hesitation, no doubt. I knew it was Jesus. He stood just a few feet away from me, watching me with eyes that held more love than I had ever known. He didn't need to say anything. In that single moment, with just one look, I felt everything. My entire life was laid bare before him, not in a way that made me feel ashamed, but in a way that made me realize how deeply he had always known me. Every thought, every joy, every sorrow, every mistake, every regret, it was all there, and he saw it all. But there was no condemnation, no anger, no disappointment, only love. A love so deep, so complete, so unlike anything I had ever experienced, that it made everything else I had ever called love seem small in comparison. I wanted to speak. I wanted to ask where I was, what was happening, why I was standing before him instead of waking up in a hospital somewhere. But the words didn't come. Not because I couldn't speak, but because I didn't need to. He already knew everything I wanted to say. Then he finally spoke. There is something you need to see. As soon as the words left his lips, the world around us changed. The light didn't disappear, but it shifted. The warmth remained, but suddenly I was no longer standing in that peaceful space. The ground beneath me felt more solid. Before I could fully process the change, I realized we were no longer alone. I was looking at something that felt both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. I saw people, cities, streets filled with movement. At first, everything seemed normal. People going about their lives, talking, working, laughing, carrying on with their daily routines. But the more I observed, the more I realized something was wrong. Jesus stood beside me, watching, waiting for me to see what he already knew. At first, I didn't understand. I saw families gathering, people attending church, communities coming together. It looked like people were living their lives as they always had. But the longer I looked, the more I saw something wasn't quite right. I observed how the situation became clearer, revealing that division existed everywhere, not just in the way people communicated or interacted, but in their very hearts. I noticed how they looked at one another, the silent judgments, the concealed resentments, and the deep-rooted anger passed down through generations. I saw individuals holding on to pain, unwilling to release the past, using it as an excuse to keep others at a distance. I witnessed groups segregating themselves, erecting barriers that were never meant to be there. But what was even more heart-wrenching was that even within the churches, division persisted. I saw congregations who claimed to worship the same God, yet refused to unite. I saw individuals who spoke of unity but lived in isolation. I saw places where love was preached, yet never practiced. As I observed, it became clear that so many of them didn't realize what they had lost. They couldn't see each other as I saw them. Jesus, his voice heavy with sorrow, said, "They've forgotten." I turned to him, my heart weighed down, asking, "Why is it like this?" His words, simple yet profound, settled within me. Humanity was made in his image. Every person was designed by his hand, each one reflecting his love. But somehow we stopped seeing each other this way. We began defining ourselves by factors that were never meant to divide us: race, nationality, status, and culture. Things that became walls rather than bridges. For the first time, I truly understood how deeply those walls had been built. People carried wounds that were not even theirs, as pain from the past shaped how they treated each other in the present. Some clung to their suffering, allowing it to turn into anger, while others ignored the pain entirely, refusing to acknowledge the wrongs of the past. Amidst it all, I saw a world blind to the very thing that could heal it. Jesus looked at me, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held something I couldn't ignore. Sadness, yes, but also urgency. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't just something I was meant to witness. It was something I was meant to act on. The scene around me shifted so quickly that I barely had time to comprehend what was happening. One moment, I was surrounded by a warmth like no other, a peace unlike anything I had known. The next, I found myself in a completely different place. No longer in that heavenly realm, I was now gazing down at the earth, seeing it from an entirely new perspective. The vastness of the world unfolded before me, cities rising, streets bustling, people filling every space. I saw everything all at once: the quiet suburbs, the towering skyscrapers, the small villages, the crowded markets, the homes, the churches, the places where life continued as it always had. At first, everything seemed so normal, but soon I began noticing things I had never truly seen before. Or perhaps I had seen them, but hadn't understood their depth. People were divided, not only by physical barriers like land and borders, language or culture, but by something far deeper, something that had taken root in their hearts and shaped the way they viewed one another. I watched as they went about their daily routines, passing by one another in the streets, standing beside each other in stores, sitting in the same rooms, yet still feeling worlds apart. In their eyes, I saw judgment, sometimes subtle, sometimes more obvious. I noticed how some regarded those who were different with suspicion, hesitation, and unspoken assumptions that had been passed down through generations. I saw how groups turned against each other, how history's wounds remained open, and how old injustices had turned into new resentments. Some carried the weight of oppression, their pain turned into anger, a quiet rage that shaped their worldview. Others clung to power, afraid of what might happen if they let it go, unwilling to see others rise, afraid of losing what they believed was theirs to keep. Jesus stood beside me, watching the same scene, his expression filled with sorrow. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was a profound sadness for what had become of his creation. "All were made in my image," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made me shiver. "But look at what has happened." His words lingered in the air, pressing into me, forcing me to truly grasp what I was witnessing. This wasn't just a superficial issue, a mere disagreement or misunderstanding. No, this was something much deeper, a spiritual matter. I looked closer and saw how tightly people clung to their identities, not as children of God, but as something else. Some held on to their race, nationality, status, or affiliations, treating these as the defining factors of their worth, elevating them above all else, even above God. They used past wounds as justifications for building walls, reasons to hate, to remain separate. Others ignored history altogether, refusing to acknowledge the suffering of those before them, unwilling to listen, unwilling to understand. It was painful to witness, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on me in a way I had never felt before. This was not how things were meant to be. This was not God's plan for his people. They do not see each other as I see them, Jesus said, his voice full of sorrow. I looked up at him, my heart heavy with the truth of what he was showing me. Why is it like this? I asked, though deep down, I already knew the answer. They have forgotten, he replied. In that moment, I understood completely. Humanity had been created in his image, each person a reflection of his love. But over time, people stopped seeing that. They began defining themselves by things that were never meant to divide them. Race, nationality, social status, political views, all of it used to build walls, not bridges. People had allowed those differences to take precedence over their identity in Christ. I saw how this mindset had seeped into every part of society, shaping cultures, families, conversations, and actions. It wasn't just about history or injustice. It was about how people had allowed these things to overshadow love, forgiveness, and their calling to unity in Christ. And then I saw something even more disturbing. The division wasn't just in the world. It was in the church as well. I saw congregations where people worshiped the same God, read the same Bible, followed the same Savior, yet remained separate. Some churches were divided by race, others by culture, and still others by unspoken barriers that kept people apart, even as they sat in the same room. I saw believers who professed to follow Christ but still carried prejudice in their hearts. I saw others who thought they were above it all, blind to how they had contributed to the separation. This is not what I wanted, Jesus said, his voice soft but filled with certainty. His sadness was palpable. People had convinced themselves that their differences mattered more than their unity. They believed their pain, struggles, and experiences were too significant to overcome. But what they had forgotten was that none of those things could compare to the love of God. None of them could match the sacrifice Jesus made for everyone, no matter their background or struggles. The enemy had blinded them, convincing them that they were too different, too divided to ever truly become one. Because of this, people had stopped trying. I turned to Jesus, my chest tight with emotion. "Can it be changed?" I asked. His eyes met mine, filled with the same love I had seen from the beginning. "They must remember who they are," he said simply. "They must return to me." It wasn't just about acknowledging the problem or admitting that division existed. It was about returning to the truth, back to the one thing that could heal what had been broken. People had spent so much time looking at each other through the lens of the world, through history, through pain, through differences, that they had stopped seeing each other through the eyes of God. Until that changed, nothing else would. I felt the weight of his words deeply within my soul. This wasn't just something I had been allowed to see. This was something I needed to understand and carry with me when I returned, if I returned. At that moment, I didn't know if I would. All I knew was that this truth, this painful, undeniable reality, had been shown to me for a reason. I somehow knew that what Jesus was about to show me next would be even more important. The vision shifted again, and I found myself witnessing time unfold in a way I had never experienced before. It was as if I were standing outside of history, watching it play out like pages of a book, turning too quickly for me to capture any one moment. Yet, I understood everything that was happening. I saw the rise and fall of civilizations, the shaping of nations, and how humanity had divided itself repeatedly. At first, the images were beautiful. People working together, building, creating, and discovering. But then, something shifted. I saw people being driven from their homes, families torn apart, their freedom stripped away. I saw chains, whips, and ships filled with human beings treated as less than human. Faces filled with pain, fear, and hopelessness, slavery, war, oppression. Things I had read about, learned in history books, but now witnessed through the eyes of those who had lived through it. The suffering didn't end when chains were broken or wars were over. It lingered, passed down from generation to generation, with some carrying anger, others guilt, and still others wounds so deep they never fully healed. Jesus stood beside me watching. His sorrow was almost unbearable. They were meant to love one another, he said, but they chose fear instead. I continued watching as history moved on, faces and names changing, but division remaining. Some were told they were inferior because of their appearance, birthplace, or language. Others clung to power, afraid of losing their place, afraid to admit the wrongs done by those before them. Then I saw leaders, powerful voices rising at different times, some fighting for justice, for healing, but others using division for their own gain. Some political leaders convinced people that they had to hate each other to protect themselves. They told them that unity was impossible, that survival meant staying apart, fearing those who were different. They disguised control as security, turning people against one another, feeding their insecurities and pain instead of offering solutions. But it wasn't just political leaders. I saw religious leaders as well, those who were meant to represent God, standing behind pulpits and preaching messages that deepened the divide instead of healing it. Some twisted scripture to justify oppression, others ignored the suffering around them, refusing to acknowledge injustice because it was easier to pretend it didn't exist. I wanted to turn away, but I couldn't. I watched as people absorbed these messages, letting them shape how they viewed each other, how they saw the world. And the enemy was there too, whispering lies into the ears of the powerful, the hurting, and even those who wanted to do what was right but didn't know how. It wasn't just about race, power, or status. It was about division in all its forms. I saw people fighting over things that didn't matter, over status, wealth, or tradition. I saw people who claimed to love God, yet refused to love their neighbors because of differences that should never have mattered. I saw families torn apart, communities shattered, churches splitting over arguments that had nothing to do with eternity. I witnessed something even more troubling. Within the very confines of the church, division persisted. Certain congregations were entirely segregated, their members all looking alike, living similarly, and staying within their own circles, never opening their doors to anyone who was different. Some preached unity, but in practice, they lived in quiet separation, never reaching beyond their comfort zones, never questioning why this divide still, 3011, existed. Others refused to acknowledge the past wounds, behaving as if history had no bearing on the present, expecting people to simply move on without confronting what had been done. Jesus gazed at me, his voice heavy with sorrow but also firm, sending a chill through me. "This is not what I wanted," he said. "I created them all. I love them all. But they have forgotten." His words settled deeply within me. The truth was harsh, but undeniable. Humanity had forgotten who they were, forgotten that they were all made by the same hands, loved by the same God. They had allowed themselves to be divided, believing the lie that they were meant to be separate, that their differences mattered more than their commonalities. I turned to Jesus, my heart aching. "How do they fix it?" I asked. "How do they undo what has been done?" His expression remained unchanged. "They must return to me," he replied simply. "Only my love can heal what the world has broken." The vision shifted again, and I felt my soul brace for what he was about to show me next. I realized that what I had seen was only a part of the truth, that there was more to understand, more to carry with me. Deep down, I knew that the answer wasn't just for the world, it was for me too. Jesus lifted his hand, and in an instant, my perspective changed. I was no longer an observer. I no longer saw history from the outside. Instead, I began to see people as he saw them, and it was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I didn't see race, nationality, or the markers that humanity had used to divide itself for so long. I saw souls, and they were all the same. There was no division, no hierarchy, no one standing above another. There were no privileged, no forgotten, no chosen, and no rejected. Each soul carried the same value, the same light, the same essence of God's love. There was no such thing as someone being worth more because of where they were born or how they looked. And no one was worth less because of their circumstances. They were his, and that was the only thing that mattered. Then I saw the pain. I saw people who had been hurt by racism, oppression, and rejection. I saw their wounds, spiritual, not physical, etched deep within their souls. Some carried scars passed down through generations, wounds that had never been allowed to heal, pain reinforced by the world around them. Jesus felt their suffering. I could see it in his eyes, in the way he looked at them. He wasn't distant from their agony. He had been there in every moment of their oppression, in every injustice, in every time they were made to feel less than what he created them to be. He had seen every insult, every exclusion, every act of cruelty, and he had wept for them. He had never turned away. But then I saw something unexpected. I saw people who had been falsely accused, those burdened with guilt for things they had never done, carrying the weight of history even though their own hands had never caused harm. Some were born into privilege they never asked for, living in fear of being hated simply because of the past. Others had tried to help, to bring healing, but had been rejected, told they could never understand. Jesus felt their pain too. He had seen those struggling to reconcile history with the present, those wanting to make things right but unsure how. He had seen people trying to bridge the gap, only to be met with suspicion, with walls built from years of hurt. He had seen how division was kept alive, not just by those wanting to oppress, but by those so deeply wounded they didn't know how to move forward without carrying the past with them. It was all pain, and Jesus carried it all. I understood then that the answer wasn't to ignore race, to pretend history hadn't happened, or to act as if the past pain had no effect on the present. The answer wasn't to dismiss the wounds of the suffering, nor was it to blame those who had never committed the sins of their ancestors. It wasn't to hold on to anger or let guilt divide people further. The answer was Him. Only His love could heal what the world had broken. For the first time, I understood how the enemy had used race to divide people, how something God had created as beautiful, diversity, culture, uniqueness, had been twisted into something that caused pain, separation, and hatred. Instead of seeing different races as expressions of God's creativity, people had been taught to see them as barriers, as reasons to stay apart, excuses to elevate one group over another. I realized how much time humanity had wasted fighting battles God never intended them to fight. Jesus had never made one race superior to another, nor had he chosen one group above the rest. Every human being had been created with the same love, the same purpose, to know him and love one another. Yet the world had twisted this truth. People had been conditioned to believe their differences mattered more than their unity. They were led to think their skin color, nationality, or background defined them more than their identity as children of God. Some were taught to see themselves as less, while others were taught to see themselves as greater. In the process, they had all forgotten the truth. I saw what the world had gotten wrong. It wasn't wrong to acknowledge race, to see beauty in different cultures, or to recognize that history left wounds that needed healing. But it was wrong to let those things become more important than the love of Christ. It was wrong to let past pain dictate future relationships, to let anger and division be stronger than the call to forgive and unite. I watched as Jesus stretched out his hand, and suddenly I saw people reaching for one another, choosing love instead of resentment, reconciliation instead of separation. They chose to see each other as God saw them, rather than how the world had conditioned them to. I saw churches breaking down the walls that had kept them apart for so long. I saw families learning to heal, to talk, to listen. I saw people letting go of bitterness, not because their pain didn't matter, but because they refused to let it define them anymore. And for the first time, I saw hope. Jesus looked at me again, and I understood what he was telling me. This wasn't just a vision for me to witness. This was a truth I needed to take back, a message to be shared. The world would continue to tell people they were too different, too divided, too broken to ever come together, but Jesus had already paid the price for unity. He had already made a way for healing. He had already provided the only solution that could truly mend what had been torn apart. People just needed to see. They needed to see each other as he saw them, and that was the only way everything would change. The vision shifted again, and what I saw next was unlike anything I had ever seen before. After witnessing the pain, division, and the weight of history that had shaped how people saw one another, I was now shown something entirely different, something I never thought I'd witness. I saw forgiveness, not just words, not forced gestures, but true, deep, complete forgiveness. I saw people who had carried the weight of resentment for years, generations even, suddenly letting go. It was as if they had been holding chains around their hearts, and in an instant, those chains were released. I watched as individuals who had suffered genuine oppression, mistreatment, and rejection chose to move forward, not by ignoring what had happened, but by refusing to let it control them any longer. I saw people embracing, weeping together, breaking down walls between them. It wasn't shallow or forced, it was real. Jesus stood beside me, watching with love in his expression. "This is what I desire," he said, "that they love one another." I saw churches uniting, not because they were told to, not out of obligation, but because they truly saw each other as family. No longer were there separate places of worship for different groups, no unspoken divisions keeping people in their own corners. Instead, they gathered together because they all belonged to the same kingdom. They weren't united by flags, nationalities, or social statuses. They weren't divided by history or tradition. They were simply God's people, standing together, worshiping together, living together in unity. It was something so simple, yet the world had complicated it. The enemy had spent generations convincing people unity was impossible, that their differences were too great to overcome, that the wounds of the past could never truly heal. But Jesus was showing me the truth. He was showing me what could happen if people chose to see each other as he saw them. I saw families teaching their children not to carry the burdens of division into the next generation. I saw parents telling their children they didn't have to inherit hatred, that they could choose a different path. I saw young people refusing to let history dictate their relationships, choosing instead to build something new, something that resembled heaven on earth. This is how they move forward, Jesus said, not by ignoring what has happened, but by choosing love despite it. I felt those words sink deep into my soul. For so long, the world had taught people that moving forward meant pretending the past didn't exist or using it as fuel for more division. But neither approach led to healing. True healing didn't come from forgetting. It came from acknowledging the pain and choosing love anyway. I saw people reaching across once impossible barriers. I saw churches inviting one another in, no longer seeing themselves as separate groups but as one body in Christ. I saw people no longer defining themselves by their skin color, background, or nationality, but simply by their identity as children of God. Then I saw something even more powerful. I saw leaders choosing truth over fear. Political leaders, pastors, teachers, all of them. Those who had once been afraid to speak about unity, worried about offending anyone, or unsure of how to approach the conversation, were now standing up and declaring what Jesus had always wanted: love, unity, reconciliation, not as distant ideals, but as a way of life. For so long, people had been afraid to talk about race, injustice, and the divisions in the world. Some had avoided the conversation altogether, while others used it to create more anger and pain. But now I saw leaders who were no longer afraid. They weren't afraid to say that racism had hurt people, that the past had created real wounds, but they also weren't afraid to say Jesus was the only answer. They weren't afraid to call people to repentance, not just those who had caused harm, but those who had refused to forgive. They weren't afraid to say the world's way of solving division had failed, and the only way forward was through Jesus alone. I saw revival, not just in churches, but in homes, schools, governments, and communities. It wasn't the kind of revival where people simply filled pews. It was a revival of the heart. People were waking up, realizing they had spent too long letting the enemy keep them apart, letting history define their future, letting bitterness hold them back from the freedom Jesus had already paid for. And I saw something else too. I saw people truly listening to one another, not listening to respond, not listening to argue, but listening to understand. I saw people willing to hear the pain of others without becoming defensive. I saw those who had suffered finding peace in the knowledge that their pain had been acknowledged. I saw those who had been misunderstood finally being given the chance to show their hearts. People weren't looking at each other as oppressors or victims, as enemies or threats. They were seeing each other as brothers and sisters. This is how we move forward. Not by ignoring history, but by refusing to let history define our relationships today. Not by seeking revenge, but by seeking understanding. Not by holding on to resentment, but by choosing forgiveness. even when it seems impossible. Not by separating ourselves into groups, but by recognizing that in Christ we are already one. Jesus turned to me again, his eyes full of love, yet filled with the same urgency as before. They must not wait for the world to tell them when to love, he said. They must choose love now. I felt the weight of his words settle deep within me. He wasn't just showing me what could be, he was showing me what must be. It wasn't enough for people to hope for unity. It wasn't enough for them to say the right things publicly while holding on to resentment privately. They had to make the choice to forgive, to love, to heal, to walk forward together as one. And in that moment understood that the reason he had sent me back was because the world needed to hear this message. And the time to make a change wasn't some distant moment, it was now. Everything around me transformed in an instant. The vision of people coming together, the overwhelming love of Jesus, the hope that had filled my heart, all faded as I felt something gently pulling me away. It wasn't abrupt or violent, but it was undeniable. It felt as though I was being pulled backward, away from Jesus' presence, away from the place where I had witnessed so much truth. I turned to him, desperate to hold on, to stay just a little longer. There was so much more I wanted to understand, so much I hadn't asked yet. But before I could speak, Jesus met my gaze with a deep look of love and firm certainty. "Go back," he said. His voice was soft, but there was a weight to it that left no room for doubt. This was no request. It was a mission, a command. Before I could even respond, before I could ask how, everything around me collapsed into darkness. The warmth disappeared, the light faded, and the peace I had felt just moments before was gone. Then I gasped for air as coldness hit me like a wave, sharp and relentless. My lungs burned as they fought to take in air, my chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. Every part of me ached. My head throbbed as I became aware of the solid ground beneath me. The world around me felt heavy, too real, too harsh compared to where I had just been. I wasn't in that heavenly place anymore. I was back. A voice called my name, distant at first, but growing clearer. Someone was shaking me, their hands gripping my shoulders, their breath visible in the cold air. I blinked, trying to focus, to make sense of what was happening. "Angela, oh my God, are you okay?" I recognized the voice but needed a moment to place it. It was my neighbor, the one who had seen me lying motionless on the ground and rushed to help. I tried to speak, but my lips were numb, my body still trying to catch up with what had just happened. "You weren't breathing," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought," she paused, swallowing hard. "I called an ambulance. Just stay still." I wasn't sure what to say. How could I explain what had just occurred? How could I tell her I had seen Jesus, that I had left this world entirely and had been sent back with a message so urgent? I didn't have time to process any of it. The sirens were already nearing, flashing lights reflecting off the icy pavement as paramedics arrived. They lifted me onto a stretcher, questions thrown at me, voices overlapping. They checked my pulse, my breathing, shining a light in my eyes, trying to understand how I had survived such a fall, how I had gone without oxygen and was still here, fully conscious. But even as they spoke to me, as they wrapped me in blankets and tried to keep me awake, all I could think about was what I had just left behind. I had died. I had stood before Jesus. I had seen the truth about the world, about humanity, about the way forward, and now I was back. The ride to the hospital was a blur. I answered what little I could, saying I had slipped on the ice, lost consciousness, and didn't remember much after the fall. It was easier than trying to explain what had truly happened. No one would believe me if I told them the truth, at least not yet. Later, lying in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt different. It wasn't just that I had survived something that should have killed me, but that I wasn't the same person who had fallen that morning. Something inside me had shifted. I could feel it deep within me, a knowing that seemed to have been engraved into my very soul. I had been sent back for a reason. I had to speak. It didn't matter if people doubted me or rejected what I said. I had been given this experience for a reason, and I couldn't stay silent. Lying there, staring at the fluorescent lights above, I whispered the words to myself, letting them settle into my spirit. I will tell them, and I knew without a doubt that this was only the beginning. When I told my family what had happened, Their reactions were exactly what I had expected. Mixed. Some believed me immediately. My mother held my hand, tears in her eyes, whispering prayers under her breath as she listened. My sister sat quietly, nodding, not questioning a single word, as if she had known all along that something like this could happen. But others weren't so sure. My husband shifted in his seat, his face full of concern rather than belief. "Angela," he said slowly, "you hit your head hard. The doctors said it's a miracle you didn't suffer worse injuries. Maybe, maybe your mind was trying to make sense of what happened." I understood why he was hesitant. I understood why it was easier for him to believe that my experience was nothing more than a trauma-induced hallucination rather than the undeniable reality that I had died and been sent back for a purpose. But this wasn't something I could argue about. It wasn't something I needed to convince anyone of. "I know what I saw," I told him. "I know what I heard." He sighed, rubbing his face and still unsure. But I could see it, the small hesitation in his doubt, the tiny part of him that wanted to believe but was afraid to. And that was okay, because this wasn't just about my family. I had to speak. At first I wasn't sure how to do it. How do you tell people something so massive? How do you explain that Jesus himself sent you back with a message? That he showed you what humanity had gotten wrong? That he told you to warn them? I wasn't a preacher. I wasn't someone with influence. I was just a regular woman who had gone to church her whole life, followed the routines of faith, done what I thought was right, and yet somehow I had been given this. I decided to start with my church. The Sunday after I was released from the hospital, I sat in the pews as I always had, but nothing felt the same. The songs, the prayers, the words spoken, they all felt different now. It wasn't that they were wrong, but that I had seen something deeper, something beyond the routine of worship. At the end of the service, I asked my pastor if I could speak. He hesitated, probably unsure of what I was going to say, but he finally handed me the microphone. I stepped up to the front of the church, my heart pounding. The faces staring back at me were familiar, people I had known for years, people who had prayed with me, worshiped beside me, lived their lives in faith as best as they knew how. I took a deep breath. "I died," I murmured. A murmur spread through the congregation, whispers filling the silence. Some people looked at me with confusion, others leaned in, suddenly caught in the tension of what I was about to say. "I slipped on ice, hit my head, and I died," I continued. But that wasn't the end. I stood before Jesus. I saw him, and he showed me things I can't keep to myself. The room was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. I began to tell them everything. I spoke about the pain of division, how humanity had spent so much time separating itself, clinging to race, status, and history instead of to Christ. I told them about how Jesus had wept for the way people treated one another, how he had shown me that many of us had been deceived into thinking our differences mattered more than our unity in him. I told them that the church itself had become part of the problem, that people who claimed to follow Jesus had still allowed separation to exist within their own walls. Some people cried openly, wiping away tears. Others sat in silence, their faces pale, their expressions unreadable. A few looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as if my words were pressing on something they weren't ready to confront. I didn't stop. I told them how Jesus hadn't just shown me the problem, but the answer: forgiveness, unity, love, a true return to him, not just in words but in action. He had shown me that people needed to stop letting the world tell them how to see each other and start seeing one another through his eyes. He had shown me that healing wasn't about ignoring the past, but about choosing to move forward in love instead of bitterness. He had shown me that the enemy wanted to keep people divided because a divided church was a weak church, and a weak church couldn't fulfill its purpose. And then I told them what Jesus said to me before I returned. "Go back. Tell them." The weight of those words filled the room, pressing against every person listening. I stepped back, handing the microphone to my pastor. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he took it. He was shaken, just like the rest of the congregation. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, "but I believe you." That was all it took. From that moment on, word spread. Some people left church that day, unable to look me in the eye. Some avoided me entirely, unwilling to wrestle with what I had said. But others came to me, tears streaming down their faces, telling me that they had felt something shift inside them as I spoke, that they knew in their hearts what I had said was true. And then it began. People started talking, confessing, reconciling. I saw people who had never acknowledged each other before suddenly reaching out, breaking down the walls they had built between themselves. I saw real conversations about race, history, and faith, not to argue, but to heal. I saw churches that had always been separate start coming together, praying as one, choosing unity over division. This wasn't just about me. This wasn't about a story. This was about Jesus calling his people back. And I had no choice but to keep speaking. Because once you've seen what I've seen, once you've stood before Jesus and heard the sorrow in his voice, once you've been sent back with a mission, you don't stay silent. The world needed to hear this, and I was going to make sure they did. We were never meant to live divided. That was never God's plan for us. From the very beginning, we were created in his image, meant to reflect his love, his kindness, his unity. But the world had twisted that truth, convincing us that our differences were more important than what we had in common. History had left deep wounds, scars passed from generation to generation. Instead of healing, those wounds had been reopened, time and time again, keeping people separated by race, culture, and wrongs that were never meant to define the future. But Jesus showed me the truth. I saw the pain, the division, and how it had consumed people, how anger, resentment, and fear had taken the place of love. Some were burdened by the weight of oppression, struggling to move forward because of the past. Others were trapped by guilt, not knowing how to make things right, afraid to say the wrong thing. And in the midst of it all, the enemy was watching, feeding the fire, using division as his greatest weapon, knowing that a broken, divided people could never be strong. But Jesus never intended for us to carry the burdens of history as weapons against one another. He never wanted us to let pain dictate how we love. He didn't ignore suffering. He didn't pretend injustice didn't exist. But he also didn't allow it to be greater than his love. The only way forward is through him. That was the message he sent me back with. That was the truth I had to speak, no matter who was willing to hear it. It wasn't enough to simply acknowledge the past. People had to choose to move beyond it, to heal, to reconcile, to forgive. That didn't mean forgetting what had happened. It didn't mean pretending everything had always been right. It meant learning from the past without letting it control the future. It meant choosing forgiveness over anger, unity over division, love over hate. Jesus made it clear that the world's solutions would never work. The world tells people that justice means payback, that peace comes from silence, that unity is impossible. But Jesus showed me that real peace, real healing, real unity only comes through him. So now I ask you, what will you do with this message? Will you let go of the chains that have held you back? Will you choose to see others the way Jesus sees them? Not as enemies, not as strangers, but as brothers and sisters? Will you forgive, not because the past doesn't matter, but because Jesus is greater than the past? I don't know who needed to hear this today, but I know that Jesus didn't show me these things for no reason. He didn't send me back to stay silent. He sent me back to tell you that he is calling his people to come together, to stop letting the world dictate how we see each other, to stop allowing the enemy to divide us. This is the final warning. It's time to return to him, fully, completely, without hesitation. It's time to lay down everything that has kept us apart, to break the chains of resentment, to stop letting the world decide how we treat one another. It's time to come back to the truth that in Jesus we are one. This is what he revealed to me, and now it's up to you to decide what to do with it. Thank you for watching. If this message spoke to you, like, share, and subscribe so that more people can hear this truth. Jesus is calling us back, and the time to respond is now.